Hello and welcome to the Simplified podcast, where we'll be discussing delivery of regulatory change. I'm joined today by our director, Kate Montserrat, lead consultant, Dom Howes, and consultant, Aneta Mirza. Welcome all.
Hello.
So regulatory change, it's an ongoing demand for us across financial services. Apart from a little respite during COVID, I think it's something that we're constantly dealing with. And we wanted to talk a little bit today around what's coming up and also the challenges that are faced by our clients and how we can help. So Dom, can I come to you first? What's sort of the landscape looking like in terms of regulatory change?
So I think there's kind of two key themes actually coming out over the last few months. I think there's one aspect which is the regulator starting to flex their muscles in a post-Brexit world, and there's obviously some legislation going through at the moment which may or may not change based on the Conservative leadership election. So that's something to keep an eye out for. The other theme, and probably the most interesting for what we're going to discuss today, is around consumer protection. So obviously the big one coming out in the recent last week or so is consumer duty. So that's going to be quite a fundamental shift in terms of how firms view and kind of protect consumer objectives. So it's for the first time saying that all activity needs to ensure that customers' objectives are being met by the firm across kind of products, correspondence, servicing, etc. So that's going to be really interesting to see how that develops. There's also other things in terms of disclosures. So we've got climate change and ESG that's coming in relatively soon that needs some further work. We've also got the beefing up of operational resilience. So that obviously was introduced earlier this year. Firms need to continue to monitor, test, and ensure that they have the right levels of resilience to kind of protect the customer through the key journeys. And also pensions dashboard, which is going to come in over the next kind of 12 months and ongoing from there. So that's obviously about making sure that the customers have better access to the key information about their accounts and that they can see that all in one place. So that's going to allow for further ability to compare and potentially switch between providers, which is obviously something that the FCA have been keen to promote over the last few years. So a lot going on. I think that angle of consumer protection is really one that's coming out a lot over the last few months.
Brilliant, thanks Dom. So yeah, incredibly busy times. Kate, can I come to you? In terms of our clients, what are the sort of key challenges that they're facing with delivery of regulatory change?
I think in particular with consumer duty, I think obviously there's sort of further guidance that's been released more recently, but it's so wide reaching and crosses so many different things and is actually quite subjective. I think firms are really struggling with actually knowing practically what to do. It's a bit like TCF, you know, it's a bit like sort of MiFID II, but kind of more holistic. So I think all firms across the industry are really struggling with practically how are they going to implement consumer duty and what does that mean kind of in practice. And I think that's a theme across regulatory change, to be honest. I think the regulator has the best interests of the consumer at heart, which is absolutely the right thing. They set kind of parameters and thematics, but it is very open to interpretation. So it's difficult for firms to kind of go out and go, yes, we need to meet XYZ or do XYZ requirements and tick will be compliant. It's almost interpreting a number of themes and then trying to make that into something that's real, that could be applied in a system or updated in a correspondence template, etc. So I think those areas of grey are really challenging for our clients.
Aneta,
Yeah.
Oh sorry, Dom,
sorry.
you go.
Well, I was just going to say, because obviously consumer duty is a really good example of that because of the FCA are looking at governance by principle. They're looking at saying, like, actually, we want this to be cultural. We want this to be embedded in everything that you do, which is a great aspiration. And, I think that's, you know, a good direction to go in, but there needs to be some level of understanding practically what does that mean, and actually leaving it fully up to firms with not a great amount, you know, it's not a huge amount of time to implement. They gave a little bit of an extension, but it's still fairly soon that they need to define that by. It is a real challenge when you don't have more guidance to work to. So you know, it's a challenging thing, and you know, firms are going to need to understand pretty quickly what they're going to do in order to deliver to that new regulation.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and I think that's where the impact analysis comes in from the business perspective. So impact analysis is key to success of the delivery of a regulatory change, but at the same time, it can be the biggest challenge. So whilst the businesses will try to kind of address the points, and they may know at high level kind of the business areas impacted by the change, by the regulations, more often than not, when it comes to that next level of details and understanding where the gaps are, what actions are required to actually address those gaps, that's where the problems arise. And I think one of the reasons for that is limited understanding of the operations, processes, procedures, controls that they've got in place, and kind of utilizing that to be able to address where the impacts are, and kind of speeding up this process and helping to lead that impact analysis through. Quite often this leads to number of different areas and SMEs needing to get involved to be able to address that level of details, whereas if the organizations had the right level of process maps and controls documented and kept up to date, that would certainly help to address those problems. And from experience, we have seen when we have helped our clients to implement those process maps, those controls documentation through using our Simplify DNA, where they could actually see the benefits of that work and speeding up the impact analysis and the process when any change comes in.
Yeah, it's going to become increasingly important, isn't it, to have a really good sense of where you are at the moment in order to identify what the change is going to be. I think not only is change becoming more regular as time goes on, but it's also becoming more wide-reaching as well. So there's always going to be a need to know where you're sitting and understand what the previous change actually introduced and where you are at the end of that point, so you can then move forward from there. So things like process maps, etc., are going to be even more important. I think operational resilience effectively said you need to have your process maps there and ready to go, certainly across those key areas that they're going to impact the customer. It feels right that needs to extend to almost all activities that the firm's undertaking.
Annette, you mentioned impact analysis. I think one of the challenges we've also seen is around when to start some of this change. So when you get a high level view of the regs versus those regulations confirmed, there can often be a huge lag between the two, and it's almost a gamble as to when you start that piece of work, whether it's going to be wasted effort or get you ahead of the game. So yeah, that's something that I've seen with some of the clients as well. That's a real challenge that can impact, what is already a constrained resource pool.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. And what quite often is important in the businesses is the engagement of business compliance teams in supporting that change. So they understanding of the business, the processes, how these are impacted are key to support and lead the business on when this analysis should start and the people that need to get involved. From experience, also what we have seen is that kind of initially we may get the engagement of key business areas, but as you progress and the timelines are set, 9 of 10 times, we find out that obviously that timeline gets extended due to the fact that that level of understanding is very limited, and more resources needs to be pulled in order to understand the impact and the processes that can underline and are impacted by the regulations.
I think it's really challenging for businesses, isn't it? When you spin up a project, that's a huge activity in itself. So they're committed, and then you're working towards a deadline, and then the regulator gives you an additional year. So what do you do then? Take another year? So that's another year's worth of cost, worth of resource, worth of disruption. They're not working on anything else in the business. So I really do feel for the businesses in terms of trying to deliver regulatory change, because it is a really tricky balancing act, like you say, Emma. You know, when do you actually start?
Absolutely.
I think the other thing that we find is just around that tension between strategic projects and regulatory change. So regulatory change is kind of very important, you know, keeps you in business, keeps the lights on, but obviously businesses want to move their business forward. They want to upgrade systems, they want to transform their business, they, you know, want to launch new products, but often budgets are a set amount, and you know, when times are tough or when markets drop or whatever, that money is impacted, and that money normally has to go on to regulatory change because it's mandatory. You have to do it in order to keep operating the business. So often we find there's a real tension between kind of the regulatory change and the impact on SMEs and project resources versus what do the exec actually want to move forward? How do they move the business forward when they haven't got the money, the resources to do that strategic change?
Yeah, and I guess that just emphasises the importance of efficient delivery of regulatory change, doesn't it? So you've got to do it, so you need to minimise the cost of it so that you can spend the rest of your change budget on the sexy stuff, the transformational things that will grow your business. Dom, what about the sort of industry standards where people are developing solutions and so on? That can sometimes impact certainly some of our smaller clients, can't it?
Yeah, it's obviously a really important part of this is to keep your finger on the pulse of what is happening in the wider industry, because especially when you have vague or slightly undefined regulations, and obviously that's open to interpretation, there will be some level of the industry coming together to some form of conforming standards. It's making sure that you're aware of that discussion. You don't do this change completely in silos. You look for external help that can provide that kind of viewpoint. And it also links to some of the points around when do you start, because obviously if you start too early or you commit yourself too forcefully to a particular method of implementation or particular requirements, etc., actually that can end up not being the right way forward, and you might have to unpick things or do another phase to correct what bring yourself back in line with the industry standard. So it is a bit of a balancing act. There's no kind of one right way of doing it. Being flexible to those changes is certainly one part of it, but also making sure that you have that perspective and that's feeding into your change and your requirements is also really important.
It's interesting actually that there is that sharing amongst the industry, isn't there? It's almost like could you being good at delivering regulatory change be a competitive advantage? Everyone just views it as a bit of a you've got to do it, you know, but actually you need some real skill to be able to deliver it effectively and in order to meet those requirements. And if you're doing that on your own and you're being a leader, do you have a competitive advantage over those who are taking their time, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks all. I mean, just a huge amount of challenges there. I just want to say thank you for joining me today to discuss that. And if anyone watching, if you think Simplify could help you using our Simplify DNA framework, supporting your regulatory change, please get in touch via LinkedIn or via our website. Thanks for joining us today. See you again soon.